I am going to be talking today about this, which is a comparison for planning of Japan and Iraq. And I will warn you before I get started, this is a very preliminary sketch of some new research that I've just begun. And so I'm very interested in hearing your input on this topic, and I'm still working out what shape this project is going to take. I don't even know at this point if it's an article or perhaps a book project. I'm still in that deep dive phase to see how much material is there. So that's where I am and what we're doing today. So to get ourselves started, as you've heard last year, I published a book on wartime planning for Japan, and in that book I was able to trace the origins of American policy towards Japan, and particularly I was looking at what the future of Japan would be once World War II was over. So not so much looking at the fine-grained detail of strategy of an occupation itself, but rather what the long-range plans and goals for a post-war Japan were going to be. As part of that work, I looked at the White House, so the Roosevelt and Truman presidencies. I looked at the State Department, what was then War and Navy, separate departments, now of course combined as defense. Treasury, as well as looking at think tanks, in particular the Council on Foreign Relations and the Institute of Pacific Relations. Media outlets and Congress were the big groups I looked at, and I looked at what kinds of ideas were circulating in these different groups. Now, the advantage I had in working on Japan in the 1930s and 1940s is that there were very few East Asia experts in the United States at that time. And so I was looking at a very small group of experts involved in planning, and by and large, they knew each other. So I had the opportunity to do not just our sort of typical diplomatic history of looking at government records, and those sorts of archives. I also was able to look at the personal papers of many of the people who were involved in planning. Some of those papers are housed here at Stanford, including papers of people like Joseph Ballantyne, Lachlan Curry, Eugene Dooman, and Stanley Hornbeck, who were all involved in State Department planning for post-war Japan. And by looking at their personal papers, I was able to see things like, what were they reading? What were they writing to each other in private letters? Who were they meeting with? What comments are they making in their personal records, giving feedback to the different ideas that are developing about what had made Japan a threat in the first place, and how could it be prevented from rearming and becoming a militarist threat again in the future? So this is the project that I've just completed. That research was my PhD dissertation, and that means that I worked on it for years. And I presented on the topic quite a bit at conferences and at seminars, and every time I did, I got the same two questions. The first, what about the emperor? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the second always was, what about Iraq? And for years when I was asked this question, I dodged it. I said, well, it's clearly beyond the scope of my research. I'm not a Middle East expert. And most importantly, I'm a historian, and the occupation of Iraq is not history. So I can't do it. But here's the thing. Even though I dodged the question, it's a really good question. And so now that I've finished with this previous project, I think it's time to stop shirking that question and start thinking about it in earnest. The parallels are obvious, right? First, Iraq and Japan were both occupied whole, not divided between allies like Korea and Germany. They are both international occupations, but that are dominated by the United States, with planning processes that are dominated by Americans. They're both second occupations. In the case of Japan, the occupation began in August of 1945 and September of 1945, at which time there was already an ongoing occupation of Germany, right, because Germany surrendered first. Germany was considered to be the more important occupation in the eyes of most Americans because the US is so Europe-centered. More people cared. Right? And so when planning for Japan, so often the question was, what are we doing in Germany? And how can we apply that to Japan? There's a similar phenomenon with Iraq, right? Because Iraq is invaded in the spring of 2003, at which time there has already been an invasion and an occupation, if you will, of Afghanistan. And so again, it's a second occupation. And again, you get this question, what are we doing in Iraq? What have we been doing in Afghanistan? And how can we apply those things? They're both post-colonial occupations. In the case of Iraq, it's quite clear because the US's main ally in this occupation was Great Britain, which of course had been the colonial power in Iraq after World War I. And in the case of Japan, it's a really complicated post-colonial relationship. Because on the one hand, the US is drawing on its experience as an imperial power in the Philippines as it thinks about what it's doing in Japan. But at the same time, Japan itself is an imperial power in 1945. And so Japan is being stripped of its colonies, even as it's being invaded by an imperial power. I won't talk today for the sake of time, but if you have questions, please ask me because I have a lot to say about it. There are questions of prejudice and racial bias in terms of American planning and American thinking to do with both Japan and Iraq. Both have inciting instances of an attack on American territories that seem to show that you cannot leave dangerous situations abroad. They will reach the United States, right? So this is the supposed lesson of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 both. Although I won't be talking about that much today, Inderjeet Palmar writes about this very compellingly, as does John Dower. And finally, and most obviously, right, there's an explicit use of a Japan model to justify and to conceptualize what the Americans are doing in Iraq. You hear it all the time when you go back and look at the sources and contemporary accounts. People imagine that what they're doing in Iraq is based on what they've done in Japan. Okay? So what are we talking about when we're talking about Japan? Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to give too much of a historical background here. I'm only showing you this map to point out that Japan is already a great power in 1945. And it's a thing that I think is forgotten when people talk about using a Japan model for other kinds of post-conflict occupations. Briefly on the map here, we have Japan expanding out into the Mariana and Marshall Islands after World War I, because of course Japan was on the side of the United States and the United Kingdom in World War I, and so took over Germany's colonies. We have Japan colonizing Formosa, now Taiwan, after winning a war against China in 1895, colonizing Korea after a successful war with Russia in 1905, and then in 1931 spreading north into northern China, Manchuria, and so creating really quite a large empire by 1936. More than being a great power, Japan is also a well-developed economy at this time. In the late 1930s, Japan is the US's third largest trade partner, and fully a quarter of Japan's imports are coming from the United States. So this is a highly developed economy with deep interlinkages with the United States. I'm going to skip World War II because I assume that we all know what happened. Yes? Excellent. So taking ourselves forward to the case of Iraq, what do we need to know in terms of basic background in that case? Again, I'm going to assume a fair amount of pre-existing knowledge. So I'll remind us again that Iraq had been part of the Ottoman Empire, which collapsed after World War I, and then became a protectorate of Great Britain. It was nominally made independent in the early 1930s, but in fact, British troops remained until the 1950s, when there was a leftist coup in 1958. What we want to know here is what happens in the relatively recent history of Iraq to help us think about what condition the country was in prior to invasion and occupation. And so we'll start there in 1980 with the beginning of an Iran-Iraq war. Again, this is quite familiar history, so I'll say simply this. We know that there was an Iranian revolution in 1979, and that revolution was dangerous for Iraq. It was dangerous for Iraq because Iraq is a country that is made up of three major factions. Of course, the Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. Kurds being majority Sunni Muslims, but ethnically distinct. And Iran is a Shiite majority country, as is Iraq. And so having a Shiite Islamic revolution in Iran is potentially destabilizing for Iraq because of the real threat of a fifth column of a Shiite uprising in Iraq. So it's a dangerous moment. It's also a moment in which Iran seems potentially weak. And so it's a moment for Iraq to establish itself in the region by taking advantage of the weakness of its neighbor and rival. The war goes on for 8 years. It is a bloody and horrible war in which neither side really gains much of anything. Right? Taking ourselves forward another 2 years, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. 1991, there is a UN authorization of use of force. There is Operation Desert Storm, which we've all heard of, and in 41 days of mostly aerial bombardment, you have the collapse and loss of the Iraqi army in that case. You have a sanctions regime that begins in 1991 and goes until 2003, as well as a US and Great Britain monitored no-fly zone and international weapons inspections as part of the loss of that war. So what are the goals going into these two occupations, right? Well, in the case of Japan, right, our goal is to occupy and demilitarize the country so that it will never again be a threat to peace, right? In the case of Iraq, a democratic and stable regime that will not pose a threat to its neighbors and will not possess weapons of mass destruction. So these are the stated goals at the beginning of both occupations. Commonalities. Both occupations imagine themselves to be learning lessons, right? And the image I've used here is a guy carrying bags. Of course, our ideas of history are baggage, but more than that, it's a reference to an explanation that Roosevelt had for why he was allowing different planning groups to operate during World War II and think about the post-war world. Because Roosevelt saw the lessons of a failed peace after World War I as being the most instructive thing to consider in World War II. Namely, he thought that there wasn't enough post-war planning during World War I. And so when the war was over, the winning parties went to Versailles, and he said they were like a bunch of wives running around packing at the last minute for a husband's business trip. He said, I'll find my quote, that they were rushing around, grabbing things out of closets and throwing them into suitcases. And of course, in that kind of a chaotic and rushed environment, you don't have a stable and well-developed peace plan, right? So Roosevelt's idea was to let his planners engage in some long-range planning, not to make any commitments, but that way, once the war was over, he would have a range of well-developed policy options from which he could decide. World War I is the major source of lessons for wartime planners and for the treatment of Japan. And that's a bit ironic because what this is saying Germany was defeated after World War I. It rearmed and was again a threat to peace. How do we keep Japan from pulling a Germany? Even though, of course, Japan had fought alongside the United States against Germany in World War I. And we want to remember that 1919, it seems remote to us now, but in 1939, when World War II broke out in Europe, it was only a 20-year gap, right? We're almost 20 years back from the invasion of Iraq. This is a recent and lived history for people who were involved in planning for post-war Japan. They write about this quite passionately. They talk about feeling that the dead are peering into the windows as they engage in post-war planning. They need to build a peace that will actually last this time. And they're really aware of the consequences if they can't do it. I've already mentioned that the colonial experience of the United States and the Philippines also has influence in what America imagines it's doing in Japan. In the case of Iraq, we know that Japan is a major lesson of history or thing to be thinking about as a possible way of understanding potential plans. We see this in popular rhetoric, in presidential speeches, but we also see this in private letters and records. People talking about what did we do in Japan and how can we apply it to Iraq? So that a State Department planner in what was called the Freedom of Iraq project says, I tried to think about what I knew about Japan when planning. We know that Paul Bremer, who was the top American official in occupied Iraq, wrote in his memoirs about being like Douglas MacArthur, the American general in Japan. He said, my new assignment did combine some of the vice-regal responsibilities of MacArthur. And it isn't just Japan, though. USAID and Treasury also were able to draw on their 1990s experience of post-Soviet transitions and post-conflict Balkan states as potential ideas of what to expect and what they might encounter in the case of Iraq. So it isn't only Japan. So who's involved in planning in both cases, right? Well, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it does include many of the major stakeholders in the case of Japan and in the case of Iraq. And in both cases, what we see when we look at planning is skepticism from senior officials, because planning is by its nature speculative. And while it's very useful, it seems like a waste of time when there's a war on, right? When there are actual things that are more tangible that can be done. It's also absolutely the case in Japan that planning was audacious, because up until 1943, even 1944, it was not at all clear that Japan was going to lose that war. And so planning for what we're going to do when we beat them is a strange thing to do when you're losing in the first half of 1942. Yeah. In the case of Japan, there was a real tendency to keep post-war planning quiet. And this is because the US was not the only power fighting Japan, right? Its major allies, Great Britain and China, not the Soviet Union in the Pacific for complicated reasons, have really different ideas about what a post-war Pacific should look like. And while the allies are drawn together by having common enemies, it is potentially divisive to think about what might happen once the war is over. So keeping cohesion between the allies means keeping what happens next relatively under wraps. Yeah? In the case of Iraq, there's also a tendency to keep quiet about plans because for most of the planning of the occupation of Iraq, the invasion hasn't begun yet. And so you don't want to tilt your hand that this invasion is indeed being planned and is likely, right? Unsurprisingly, I find a larger voice for the Defense Department in the case of the occupation of Iraq, and a larger voice for the State Department in the case of the planning for Japan. Now, when I was looking just at the planning for Japan, I thought that it was because there's relatively little interest in Japan, right? And so this lack of interest really screens and protects a small group of middle and low-level State Department planners who are the Japan experts, and gives them free range to have these discussions without too much input or oversight from above, right? Whereas in the case of Germany, this planning is really has much more involvement from high-level officials who are thinking more and care more about the case of Germany. And I still think that's true, but it's also absolutely the case that the military is thinking about invasion, and it's thinking about the logistical planning involved in occupation, right? And in the case of Iraq, those things are going to happen immediately. In the case of Japan, this planning is going on while a long war is going on. And so it isn't until mid to late 1944 that there starts to be serious planning on the part of the military about an invasion because it doesn't seem possible yet, right? The end game of the war only appears over the horizon late into the game. And so the military plays a smaller role. I will also say that what we see here is a difference in the ascendancy of a combined Department of Defense in terms of resources, and also the person of Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense having a much warmer and more connected relationship with the President and the Vice President than did Secretary of State Colin Powell. So the role of personal influence plays a role in which departments get more heard as well. So what do the plans actually look like? Well, they look like this. In the case of Japan, at the end of World War II, so in August and September, you have a set of policy documents that represent the sum total of American planning for Japan. These are the one that we see up here, which is SWNCC 150.4. SWINC is the acronym that people use. And this was openly available, circulated, and published, stating American objectives. It's about 12 pages long. It talks about political, economic objectives for the future of Japan. It has a sister document called JCS 1380/15, and that was a military document that was kept secret, but was based on the same foundation of planning. And as a result of these two documents, you have what historian Eiji Takamae calls a cut and paste occupation, right? In which MacArthur and his policy staff were actually able to cut up these policy documents and hand individual paragraphs that have objectives to groups, giving them assignments as new departments. For the case of Japan, because we have these finalized documents, when I wondered, where did policy planning come from? How did these ideas arise? I had an endpoint. And what I did is I worked my way backwards. Well, where did this policy come from? Who wrote it? Were there earlier iterations? How can you follow it? And as a result of that, I was able to follow through from the beginning. And by working backwards from a complete set of policy, this gave me a sense of a much smoother kind of a planning process than it probably appeared to people on the ground at the time, because I'm following back the successful tracks of policy. Yeah? So what I get essentially is this, and very briefly, because this is the subject of my book project, what we see is from the very beginning in 1939 with the outbreak of war in Europe, a problem within State Department of a desire to think about American long-range planning and war aims, but not a lot of resources, not a lot of manpower to engage in that kind of work. And so at this time, the Council on Foreign Relations based in New York had quite a few members who were also officials within the State Department. And they were working in these study groups talking about things like US interests and aims. And so the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department had a secret agreement that they would engage in what was called a War and Peace Studies project. State would give questions to the Council on Foreign Relations, who would then create memorandum and policy recommendations for the use of the State Department. This planning goes on for about 3 years, until 1942. The war's actually begun. There are actually resources inside of state to engage in their own planning. And so these Council on Foreign Relations documents become the basis of State Department planning. State Department hires in many of the people who are involved in War and Peace Studies project, so they become officials. And this is the beginning of official government planning for Japan. This group is called the IDAFE, the Interdepartmental Agency on the Far East. And because of this thing that we call alphabet soup, right, you have a renaming of the same group over time, and as you have the bringing in of new stakeholders. And so from 1943, we call this the Post-War Programs Committee. From 1944, we call it the State War Navy Coordinating Committee. But because there are so few East Asia experts, the membership of these groups in terms of Japan planning stays pretty constant throughout. So from involvement in the Council on Foreign Relations in 1939 up through the end of planning in 1945, you have this core group of officials, many of whom are the ones whose papers are available here at Hoover that I mentioned at the beginning. So this is what the policy process for Japan looks like. Right? In addition to that, you have Army and Navy getting involved, but not really until the summer of 1945, at which time they began to plan a real invasion of Japan. Right? So a relatively late entry. If Roosevelt makes any international agreements, well, of course, they have to be included in post-war planning. And finally, we have executive commitments and prerogatives. None of these policies will come to anything without the support of the executive once the war is over. And planners are very aware of that. So as they're involved in writing these reports and recommendations, they're not at all convinced that their work is going to be the basis of American policy. In fact, there are lots of reasons to think that Roosevelt's ideas were very different than the ideas of his State Department planners. But, of course, Roosevelt died unexpectedly in April of 1945. And the person that replaced him, Harry Truman, had very little experience. He became vice president only in January. He was a new vice president. And he wasn't elected. He didn't have a popular mandate. And so looking around, right, his goal was to stay the course and to maintain Roosevelt's policies. These plans were the most well-developed policies in government and had been approved by members of Roosevelt's cabinet in the past. And so the argument was, these are Roosevelt's plans, and Truman is going to carry on with them. And so they do get adopted, and they do get signed very early in the Truman administration, although there's good reason to think Roosevelt himself would have demanded changes. In Iraq, the process is different, right? And one of the main reasons is a lack of time. When we're talking about Japan, we're talking 1939 to 1945. Right? Policy planning for Iraq begins in November of 2001, when the Secretary of Defense writes to CENTCOM asking for a draft overview of a plan to forcibly remove Saddam Hussein. Importantly, in planning for Japan, there was a sharp distinction between military planning and political planning belonging to the State Department. Right? When CENTCOM wrote its draft plan for a removal of Saddam Hussein, included in that plan in December of 2001 was a long-term policy aim for the United States, which was the establishment of a representative form of government, a country capable of defending its territorial borders, and maintaining its internal security without weapons of mass destruction. It's important that the military set the long-range plans for the treatment of Iraq first. Because, as we know from studies about think tanks and policymaking, once your mental map is set, once your basic aims are decided, you're much less swayed by future input, right? Other advice that you hear later either fits into your existing map or is rejected because it doesn't, right? In early 2002, CENTCOM planners work on an invasion and stability planning project, which they called O-Plan 1003V. And in that, they gave this group, the Combined Forces Land Component Command, the responsibility of what they called Phase 4A. So right after the invasion, stabilization. So there was a small group that was in charge of planning this. The trouble is that there was a real problem with information sharing in planning for Iraq. So that the people who were involved in 4A post-invasion stabilization, they weren't senior enough to have access to the existing plans from CENTCOM, by and large. So they're planning based on speculation about what they think the plans might be. And this is something that we hear across planning. Historian Zachary Shore explains that Condoleezza Rice frequently sent her own spies to the Defense Department in hope of surreptitiously collecting the info she and her staff needed to do their jobs. And you hear a lot about this information hoarding and this problem of access to different plans. And this makes planning a bit redundant as well. From 2002, we have the State Department beginning a Future of Iraq project, which is a huge project that ultimately creates reports of more than 1,000 pages. And what's interesting about this project in particular, and what makes it different from planning for Japan, is that unlike Japan, in the case of Iraq, Iraqi exiles were involved in the planning process. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about the influence of that. There's also an executive steering group and other groups who are involved in planning as well. Now, I mentioned the problem studying the planning for Iraq is that it's not really history, right? We do have the beginnings of some documents being available from things like archives being put up by discretion by people like Donald Rumsfeld in tandem with the publishing of memoirs. So we do have access to some records, and we can use them to help to put together, in addition to published memoirs and other kinds of documents, what planning looked like in 2001, 2002, and 2003.
Could you leave the other one on for?
Yeah, just check out those objectives and think about them.
Right. Because the font is very small for those of you in the back, minimize risk of WMD attack against the United States, allies and friends, doesn't contribute to regional instability, minimize a chance of internal instability, fragmentation, and loss of control with WMDs, improves the conditions of life for the Iraqi population, ends Iraq as a safe haven for terrorists, were the main goals.
It is very fresh history.
Yes.
They didn't have much of a batting average.
And incredibly abstract.
Yes.
Yes.
Incredibly abstract.
Yes. So we have, and for the sake of time, I'll say that we have other groups that are created from February of 2003 with the creation of the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Affairs, an attempt to tie together the different threads of planning that have been going on without much involvement with each other, but partially because of a sense that the State Department's Future of Iraq project was utopian or not policy relevant and not helpful. There was an explicit attempt to sideline the Freedom of Iraq project and to keep its head from being involved in this new office. So, Treasury, a Treasury official says of the planning for Iraq, people say that there was no plan for Iraq, but I think it's more relevant to say that there were plans. There were plans, there were lots of plans created at different times by different agencies at different levels of government. Right? The problem with Iraq was that, or the problem with planning was that there was no unification bringing together a single set of plans. Yeah? So what happens when the hostilities are over, right? We have this long planning process going on in both cases, right? Well, it's very rare in an academic setting that we get a chance to quote national hero Mike Tyson. So here we go. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Both Japan and Iraq experienced what we call catastrophic success, right? An unexpectedly early surrender and collapse in both cases, right? In the case of Japan, unexpectedly, there was no invasion at all, which was the basis of military planning, right? And so the occupation of Japan begins in a way that people didn't expect, right? Early surrender, no invasion. But also people were expecting a significant resistance, right? Operation Blacklist, a military plan for the occupation, says, at best, the civilian population of Japan will observe an attitude of non-cooperation, right? But we should expect insurgents and sabotage. suicidal elements of armed Japanese taking advantage of the occupiers' relatively small numbers in a densely populated country. They proposed things like mass reprisals if you couldn't find the individuals responsible for these sabotage attacks. Right? They were expecting chaos and insurgency, and they didn't get it. Right? So much so that when the occupiers landed in Japan in August of 1945, they didn't go to Tokyo because they didn't know what the situation was going to be like. They went to nearby Kamakura. Within 2 weeks, however, they realized that this insurgency was not going to happen, right? The occupation headquarters moved to Tokyo. MacArthur wrote to Washington saying that he had plenty of troops to guarantee security in the country, and wrote to his wife and son asking for them to come and join him. So safe was it in Japan, you could bring your family. People were horrified by the level of destruction, right? They knew that there had been aerial bombardment of Japan, but seeing the homelessness and the starvation, right, it really changed people's impression of who these enemies were that had been fought, right? Suddenly, they're people who needed humanitarian assistance rather than a violent threat. And reports about what the occupation was like in Japan, they talk about chaos, right? Max Bishop, a guy who was involved in State Department planning, not in the center, but involved, was involved in the occupation. He, of all people, should have known about the significant amount of planning that had gone into the occupation. But on the ground, what he wrote was, there's a feeling that we occupiers don't know what American policy in Japan is to be. The New York Times wrote an op-ed in September saying, there's a serious concern that our basic policies for the rule of conquered countries are by no means as firmly formulated as they should be. I don't think that I need to go into examples of, from the Iraqi case, of the observation that it felt like chaos on the ground. But I think it's worth making the comparison and saying that even an occupation well planned by experts over a period of years feels like chaos in the early period, right? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. In the case of Iraq, right, again, that catastrophic success, a collapse of the government within weeks of original invasion, which means that there isn't a time to coordinate and to collaborate between different planning agencies or to get people on the ground where they're needed. Yeah? There was more damage and more looting than was expected, right? And so a 2008 RAND study quotes someone on the ground as saying that we overestimated the degree to which the remnants of the Iraqi government would provide essential services and security. But there were no bus drivers, there were no taxi drivers, everybody just went home. What in fact happened was when we decapitated the regime, everything below it fell apart. How useful is planning if our plans are wrong? Right? Well, I argue that planning is very important, but then I would, being a historian of policy planning, right? But I will argue to you that the policy planning process in both cases built knowledge within the government. It created a wealth of reports that could be relied on in future instances. As one USAID official recounted, we weren't really aware of what would be there when we got here. There would be maybe a lot of destruction, maybe a little bit of destruction. We weren't certain of the operating conditions. So what we did was put together contracts that would allow us flexibility in responding to the needs as we found them on the ground. Right? And because those plans, we said they're so vague, right? But because they're not specific, it means that they're flexible and adaptable, right? So that you can keep your long-range goal in mind as you navigate your way towards it and encounter things along the way that allow you to make small shifting, like navigating a ship, right? There's a common argument that the State Department's Freedom of Iraq project didn't have an impact and that it was a missed chance to have a better and more nuanced planning or an awareness of consequences. But there is plenty of reason to think that it was in fact helpful. Famously, Paul Bremer, the MacArthur type guy in the Iraqi case, said that he had never heard of the Freedom of Iraq project before arriving in Baghdad, and when he did read it, it was, quote, not a practical guide. But you do hear about it later being used. So the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, Douglas Feith, says that the report from the FOI on democratic principles was one of the better resources for the administration officials working on the structure of a post-Saddam government. So even if the documents weren't used in the immediate invasion process, which of course it isn't time for them yet anyhow, they can be pulled on and drawn and used later in the occupation. James Savage is an academic who did excellent work on budget planning for Iraq. And he talks about especially FOI using expats as a particularly valuable source, because it meant that people in Treasury and elsewhere could consult actual Iraqis to try to bounce ideas and get feedback about these policy plans, rather than simply working in a vacuum of Americans in Washington. I think the alumni effect is one of the most important things when we think about the influence of policy planning after an invasion and during an occupation. The people who are involved in planning are also the people who are involved in the occupation itself. Right? So that, for example, you have an official working in planning for USAID in 2002, working to set up the Office of Humanitarian and Reconstruction Agency before the invasion, and he then becomes the USAID Deputy Mission Director in Iraq, right? Or you have a young Foreign Service officer who's involved in planning for Japan, who in that planning process writes about land reform. He then becomes an official in the occupation, and on the back of his previous experience, is selected to lead the planning for land reform and land redistribution during the occupation of Japan, one of the most lasting implications of that occupation. And because you have expats in the case of Iraq, you also can look at this alumni effect in both directions. It isn't only Americans who are involved in the occupation and their continued influence on the ground, it's also Iraqis who are involved in reconstruction and rebuilding in Iraq. So that a former oil and planning minister is an expat involved in the Freedom of Iraq project, consults with Treasury during planning, and then goes on to become Governor General or Governor of the Central Bank of Iraq in 2003. Right? Plans are flexible and can be adapted because they're vague. Right? And people who are involved in the policy planning process can take advantage of the conversations, the experience, and the know-how that they gained in these long planning sessions during a policy planning period, and draw on those conversations and those networks and resources that were created by policy planning when they become officials on the ground. Right? It helps to take ideas and respond as the situation on the ground changes in unexpected ways. So where do I go from here? Right? Well, as I say, I'm not sure where exactly this project goes, right? I do think that looking at the policy planning for Japan, I see many commonalities with the policy planning in Iraq. In so many ways, the models are not good comparisons, right? We talked about Japan being a great power, right? And Iraq being a country that had first a decade of war and then a decade of crippling sanctions before invasion, right? Iraq has nothing like the resources to work with that Japan did after World War II. Japan is a homogenous country. Japan is an island archipelago, right? It doesn't share borders, so there's no question of insurgent groups coming in and being involved in the occupation of Japan, or a spread of chaos out from Japan destabilizing the rest of the region. That isolation is helpful in the case of Japan. But looking at the case of Iraq, it makes me think about the case of Japan a little bit differently. Right? Because an invasion wasn't needed for Japan, because putting down insurgents wasn't needed in Japan, I and other historians have tended to dismiss and sideline military planning for the occupation. It wasn't needed. Seems irrelevant. Yeah. But seeing the consequences of not being able to guarantee security on the ground makes me realize that even though in the event it wasn't necessary. Planning for basic security is an absolute necessity before any kind of a political goal can be implemented. And I still told you I was always asked two questions when I talk about post-war planning for Japan, right? What about Iraq, but what about the emperor? Yeah. Looking at the case of Iraq makes me realize how important the emperor was in the case of the occupation of Japan. I hadn't thought so, because the emperor is an important but a symbolic figure in post-war Japan. Doesn't seem that important to Japanese politics, right? But looking at the value of having one figure that's recognized as legitimate by the whole nation, as a unifier, keeping the taxi drivers from going home, right? Keeping an insurgency from happening. I think how valuable such a legitimizing force would have been in the case of Iraq. Now, the case of Iraq is so different. Who would that figure possibly have been in such a factionalized environment? There likely wasn't one. But it does make me think that the emperor probably has more to play, more of a role in the success of Japan than I had given that decision credit for in the past. So what lessons do we learn from history? Yeah. Well, I will say here, the lesson of Japan gave planners a false sense of confidence in their actions in Iraq, a sense that it was possible to build a stable, democratic, and most importantly, pro-US power in a volatile region through military force and occupation. But with so much messiness in the world, I think it's not possible to boil down our past experiences into some kind of a predictable mechanism. Looking to the past for lessons, it can be helpful, but in a Freedom of Iraq project kind of way, where you get 1,000 pages of things that might go wrong or things that should be considered, right? Looking to the past helps us to think about the different possibilities, what might happen, what's happened in the past, right? Looking to history for lessons can be instructive, but not in the way that policymakers hope, because the past isn't prescriptive. It doesn't tell us what's going to happen, right? So the lesson from history here, I think, is apply with caution. Thank you.
Thank you.